This is the first episode of a 5-part decorating series called Princess Chronicles. Each episode, I walk you through the icing of 2 princess dress cookies. Today's cookie features pastel purple, and I offer you insight into what I've learned throughout the decorating process. This is an edible ink marker. I often start my cookie decorating with this step because I'm still such a beginner, and it is vital that I mark out exactly where the icing will go. And since all of the cookies in the Princess Chronicles series are actually going to someone who asked me to make them for a party, I need to put all of my concentration and effort into ensuring they are made to the best of my ability. The only instruction I was given was to flood 2 dozen cookies in various pastel colors, so the rest is up to me. For most of the cookies in this series, I use the wet next to wet technique that I'm using here.
We interrupt this broadcast for a public service announcement.
I just noticed while editing the second video in this series that the technique that I said that I was using is wet next to wet. That is completely wrong. I am doing what is called flooding in sections. I have no idea where my brain was. This technique definitely isn't the quickest of ways to decorate a cookie. However, it is one that creates a very clean and polished look. While all of the cookies going to my 2 dozen will be decorated in a very simple way, the second cookie that I decorate in each of these episodes features an additional effect for me to play around with the hopes that my skill improves. We shall see. These cookies require that I separate my decorating into 3 separate stages. You can see here that I'm alternating the outlining and flooding of each pleat of the dress. I then put the cookie into my dehydrator set at 95 degrees, which is the lowest temperature setting, for about 15 minutes. This allows the top layer of the icing to dry out a little, which is typically referred to as crusted over. You see here that the icing has crusted over because it no longer looks wet. It has a smooth, matte look to it, and if you run your finger lightly over the surface, it feels smooth and cool. Just be super careful handling the cookie when it has only just started to crust over. The icing on top is stable enough to hold its shape nicely and will even be strong enough to allow more icing to be placed on top of it, but the icing just under the surface is still very wet. And if you tilt your cookie, you could easily cause a crack to show up on the surface of the cookie, and that would be a total heartbreak. Now, if I had skipped the step to allow the icing to crust over, each section of the icing would simply have melted back together, and I would be looking at my cookie thinking, what was the point of all that work? There are alternatives to using a dehydrator. One is to just leave the cookie out in the open, allowing for plenty of airflow. If you were to use this option, you may need to leave it out for about an hour before the icing has crusted over enough to achieve this look. Alternatively, you could use a fan for additional airflow. This may help reduce the time to about 30 minutes. However, temperature and humidity certainly play a role in how long this will take. I live in Southern California, where it is almost always some kind of warm, and the rest of the country laughs at us because even when we think it's humid, it isn't. I have never seen my walls sweat, and I have never had my clothes rot in my closet. We have no idea what real humidity is. I sure hope they love these cookies, but let me be real here. I'm pretty nervous about the whole thing. I've never decorated cookies for someone else. Deep breaths. Woo-saw, woo-saw. I didn't need to use my edible marker for this cookie because I'm not going to flood it in sections. I should probably tell you about my icing. For each of the cookies in this series, I have prepared 2 different consistencies of icing, a flood, and a piping consistency. The flood icing, I think, is what would be considered about a 15-second flood. Though truly, I am not convinced I really understand how to count out that particular method properly. So eventually, I think I may adopt the way the graceful baker does it and simply go by sight and feel, basically how the icing behaves. I also made what is called a soft peak piping consistency for my details. But as you will see here at the end, though it worked out quite nicely for the outline, it didn't hold up as nicely as I would have liked for the pressure pipe detail I added. If you are interested in how I made and colored all of the icing I use in this series, you are in luck. In Simple Royal Icing, I show you from start to finish the 3-ingredient recipe I use to make the basic icing. And then, in Pastel Icing, I color and bag the icing. Though, fair warning, I did shoot this episode as a working vlog, so some of my thoughts on life, making progress, and growth do make an appearance. Even though the piping consistency could have been used for my outline, at this point, I prefer to use what is called a one consistency outline and flood, meaning I make the border icing and then flood the cookie with the same icing. Also, I do not wait for the outline icing to dry at all before I flood. I prefer the completely seamless look of the icing done this way. Remember when I mentioned earlier that if I were to flood my sections next to each other without allowing each to crust over first, they would have melted back together? Well, that is exactly what I'm looking to achieve here. And the best way I know how to make it happen is to use the same consistency flood icing without allowing the outline to dry. Interesting. I just realized that to me, the look of this dress without having been flooded in sections makes the dress appear to be for a younger girl. That is a little piece of information I am going to file in the back of my brain. Now for this final edition. Admittedly, I have attempted this same heart multiple times. First, I think I'm doing it wrong. I just watched a tutorial from Little Cookie Co. You see how I start at the bottom of the heart and then push my icing up? I'm pretty sure that's backwards. I think you're supposed to push a bunch of the icing out at the top of the heart, release pressure, and drag the tip down to the bottom point. Maybe I'll remember that next time. Also, this is where it appears my icing was a tiny bit loose. It didn't quite hold its shape, but don't forget, practice makes progress. Overall, I'm quite satisfied with how all of the cookies I decorated came out, from the color of the icing to the execution. I'd say the progress I made here encourages me to move forward. After all, progress propels. I hope you will join me next time when I decorate these cookies in white. Does white count as pastel?
Next time on Kuny's Cookie Chronicles.
This is the second episode of a 5-part decorating series called Princess Chronicles. Each episode, I walk you through the icing of 2 princess dress cookies. Today's cookies feature pastel white. I attempt a technique I haven't tried before and offer you insight into what I have learned throughout the decorating process so far.